So, but turn it down. Otherwise, it's going to echo. You got to turn your volume down.
No, I know. I was just seeing how much of a delay there was.
Yeah, there's like a little bit of a delay. Okay, so I'm going to start the lecture on the topic. I know that if you are listening on Facebook Live, you can only listen. But afterwards, I will put up a recorded copy with the slides. For the rest of you that are here and now, you can see on the screen what the topic lecture is actually divided into two parts. And when I did this before, each part took about 45 minutes. So if we need to, we'll take a little bit of a break. The first part just kind of covered an overview of Korea's security issues, just kind of the background of the conflict and what's going on, and a little bit of introduction to some of the arguments. And then in the second part, I really kind of talked just about missile defense. So I think as you've all discussed in lab this morning, there are two topics on the September-October public forum ballot, and one of these will win. Most people think the second one will win, and I do agree that it is a better topic, so that's why we're kind of spending more time on this one. But the first one is resolved. Continued nuclear weapon development and missile testing are in North Korea's best interest. So this resolution kind of asks you to think like from the perspective of North Korea and say, well, gee, should they keep developing their weapons? Should they keep developing their missiles? I mean, sure. I mean, I kind of see the point of doing that, but I mean, are we really going to debate like, you know, should ISIS continue? Is terrorism in ISIS's best interest, or was like were concentration camps in like Germany's best interest? I don't know. This topic just seems like a stretch. Like it's kind of indefensible to argue that like North Korea should keep developing nuclear weapons unless you have like an incredibly narrow-minded and or not narrow-minded, but just like very narrow conception of like your self-interest. But we can talk more about that later. So the second is that resolved deployment of an anti-missile defense system is in South Korea's best interest. So, the first topic I obviously think is like heavily biased like towards the con. The second topic, as we'll discuss more even in the second lecture, is probably pretty heavily biased towards the pro, because it asks the question of kind of just missile defenses generally. And it seems kind of strange to me that like you would say it's in South Korea's best interest to like abandon its missile defense systems, given the size of the North Korean threat. So this topic like presents its own problems, but at least the way it's worded, but at least the resolution like THAAD, which I think may have come up at least in the one lab, which we'll talk about, is pretty controversial, even though probably the general question is not as controversial. So there are a few critical issues. The one is Korean missile proliferation and nuclearization desirable? And it's important to understand that a nuclear weapon, right, has two parts. There's the missile, then there's the warhead that goes on top of the missile. And that warhead could be a conventional warhead, it could be a nuclear warhead, it could be a biological weapon, it could be a chemical weapon, right? Okay, proliferation in this context kind of generally refers to the spread of. So when countries proliferate, they are developing more missiles. That's what the term refers to in the context of the literature. But I mean, proliferation just as a vocabulary word could refer to a lot of things. It could say like the number of debaters has proliferated in this room, right? But in the context, proliferation means like the spread of these weapons. Now, the other kind of central question is, how does missile defense impact missile proliferation and nuclearization? Does it solve the impacts, right? It's kind of designed to like stop a missile from hitting the population or whatever the target is. But it also can kind of encourage the development of additional missiles, right? Because one way countries can defeat another country's missile defense system is to produce more missiles and like overwhelm the system. And then kind of what are the pros and cons of missile defense kind of beyond the immediate question, right? Like sure, missile defense stops missiles from hitting the ground. Maybe it encourages arms races, but there's other related benefits, just a general technology development relations between countries. So in this kind of topic, what I'm going to cover, all right, as you can see, you're always kind of one slide ahead, is the history of the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, just basically. Korea is a modern threat. Missile defense and ballistic missiles, just a general introduction. I'll talk about it more in the next lecture. All right, and other key items to know. So let's just kind of look at like what's going on in the Korean Peninsula, and there you can see it, right? So we have China, right at the top. We have North Korea. Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea, and Seoul is the capital of South Korea. Now, up until the end of World War II, Korea was a single political entity. It was one country. And in 1948, it was split into two countries. And neither country really accepted the border. And the North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950. And really, at that time, they were explicitly backed by Russia and China. Russia and China sent soldiers, weapons, etc. Okay, and the United Nations and the U.S. engaged in kind of a pretty massive war in Korea. There's a really, it's interesting if you read in Wikipedia, it just says, well, there was a massive bombing campaign in North Korea. This was like a massive bombing campaign, right? And like nothing you kind of would have kind of read about in your lifetimes. It's not like what goes on in Iraq or Syria. I think those bombing campaigns are bad. These are like World War II, the bombing of Dresden, where it kind of wiped it out, right? So, but you got to think about that, in terms of the context, right? You got to realize that many people in North Korea were basically bombed into oblivion, right? So that kind of explains a little bit of kind of their perspective on this. But since the end of the Korean War, all right, Korea is in two countries divided by the 38th parallel, right? You can see that on the map there. You can see, the small map right on the left-hand side of the screen. You can just see explicitly the 38th parallel. Then you have over that, you have to see Japan. You can see on the bigger map, we've got Japan hanging out over there, right? So Japan's pretty close. And the other thing you really want to notice on this map is how close Seoul is to North Korea, right? It's super close. It's I think 30 miles, all right, from North Korea. So if North Korea invades South Korea, they're going to go right after Seoul. 10 million people live, all right? And won't really be hard for them to get there. So, and it's just you should note that the DPRK is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It is kind of funny, as someone in the lab that meets in this room mentioned that, it's funny that they call this a democracy because it's not. It's a completely totalitarian government. Then you have the Republic of Korea. And I should highlight too, here it says there's an armistice agreement. So North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war. They just signed this armistice agreement, agreed to stop fighting. But they're still kind of technically at war, which, adds a lot to the context of it. Over there, this is my little slide. So I went to the 38th parallel. One time I was in Korea, so there's me. And the building kind of behind me that you can see, that building is actually in North Korea, right? And when you walk into this see behind here, there's these little blue things that look like little houses or huts or whatever. You can go in there and you can see where the armistice agreement is signed. Where it was signed, and you can actually cross over into North Korea. Now, this isn't where they're going to kidnap you, right? But you can kind of walk into North Korea, so I can say, hey, I went to North Korea. This is probably not open right now, given the state of hostilities, but you can kind of go in there, and then, so that building, that was a guard, right? So there's this building, that's just a close-up picture of the guy who kept walking behind the little pillar, and then he'd come back out the other side. So when you could go up there, you would go up and you'd get taken to a certain point by a tourist company. And then the U.S. military was actually in charge of your tour, and they could tell you at any point that you had to leave. But that was a few years ago where there was a lot of tension. It's probably closed now, would be my guess. On the next slide, right, you can see right, you can see where there's this is how close you are. There's a landmine there, right? So you're driving by this bus and they're hey, don't walk over here because actually there's a mine in the ground. So you wouldn't want to step on that. Then there's these tunnels, which are important to understand later. This is just a little tourist place. But basically, North Korea has built a whole lot of tunnels under the ground, all right, that kind of probably extend all the way to Seoul. It's just that the government, we don't know where they all are. This is one of the ones that's been discovered. And this is kind of important to understand because if a war broke out, then a lot of North Korean soldiers probably carrying chemical and biological weapons would run through these tunnels and get at least part of the way into South Korea. All right, so just kind of one other point of history or context, right? China and Russia have historically supported the North, DPRK, though less now, right? And the U.S. and its allies like Japan, okay, and Australia farther to the south has supported South Korea. South Korea is economically developed. It's kind of pretty much democratic. It is officially a democracy. North Korea is very totalitarian and is very undeveloped. There's an insignificant amount of trade, most of which occurs with China. All right, kind of both formally and informally. There's a lot of kind of informal trading networks that occur, which kind of makes sanctions difficult. So just quickly on the kind of a history of two things, right? So there's a history of nuclear, or a few things. Nuclearization, right? North Korea, in May of 2008, kind of started developing weapons-grade plutonium, right? Nuclear explosion can kind of be initiated with plutonium or uranium. So they kind of started with these fuel rods in 2008. November 2010, North Korea unveiled a uranium enrichment program. It was supposed to produce lower enriched uranium for power reactors, though it's possible they tried to produce highly enriched uranium for weapons purposes. Because then, they also had conducted 5 nuclear weapons tests in 2006, 9, 2013, and twice in 2016. All right, twice in 2016. I think it was January and September. They claimed the January test was a thermonuclear device, which just means that it has a higher yield. It's a greater bomb. And yes, and the second one, September 9th, 2016, the founding of North Korea. All right, they carried out an additional nuclear test, which is a 10 to 20 ton test, which was larger than all the other ones that they carried out. So they're kind of very much been like developing the nuclear warheads, right? The parts that go on the missiles. The chemical and biological weapons are a little kind of, we know a little bit less about them, but we generally conclude that they have a pretty robust biological weapons capability. They have like anthrax and smallpox, and they've tested these on their own people, so they know that they work. Okay, they just, this is kind of not a very nice place to be. So yes, they've tested chemical and biological weapons on their own people to make sure they will die. All right, now, so that kind of gets to the warhead part of the missiles, right? But then we have the missiles. They generally have what you would call a lot of kind of like short-range missiles. There's a 500-kilometer range Scud-C and a 700-kilometer range Scud-D. Those are shorter, so you need to understand, and this is important because short-range missiles are not probably what's going to get launched at Seoul, because that's only 30 miles, 50 kilometers, okay? It's not really like where a missile travels. They have to shoot it really like far from the north. That's not how they're going to attack Seoul. The significance of that I'll talk about later. Then you have an intermediate range missile, which is approximately 1,300 kilometers. All right, then they have ones that are a little bit bigger, the Taekwondo, 1,800 kilometer range. So those are kind of missiles that go, up in the air from the ground. They also have anti-ship cruise missiles, and they kind of also have tested a solid fuel rocket motor, and they performed a second SLBM, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. This is very important because like THAAD and stuff is not designed to shoot down submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So they're developing more submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They're not very effective against. Our missile defenses are not very effective against. Now, Korea, the history, all right, 2017, they've been engaging in a lot of missile tests, all right? They threatened in June, look at the top entry in the bottom, okay? They threatened on January 1st to launch an ICBM, and nobody really thought they were going to do it. Even when I gave this lecture like 2 weeks ago, okay, we're like, well, they're going to be able to do it eventually. Nobody really knows when, maybe within a year. But on July 3rd U.S. time, July 4th South Korea time, they're 12 hours ahead of us, okay, they launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But you can see they've been testing, I'm not going to go through all this, you can download these PowerPoints and stuff, I'll show you where, but they've been kind of testing a lot of ballistic missiles in January. One is because, they have a bunch of new missiles that they want to test. Two, they tested a lot that kind of just immediately crashed into the ground. Probably because the United States had effective cyber warfare to stop their missile launches, and also people say that we put faulty supply parts into the supply chain. Like we actually put defective missile parts that they purchased, but they didn't know they were defective. So that's kind of a cool job, right? It's very like Jack Bauer, like 24, like what do you do for a living? Oh well, I get faulty missile parts put into the supply chain, so when the North Koreans purchase them, their missiles crash. That's pretty cool. But anyhow, so that may be another reason like why they've been testing more missiles. The other thing that's important to understand is that the president in March, the president of South Korea was impeached. We talk about impeaching Donald Trump. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. But they impeached their president on like corruption charges, and then they had an election for a new president. And the new president who won is more of liberal, right? Their old president was like conservative, supported THAAD deployment. Their new president, Moon, is not very supportive of THAAD deployment. Tries to play it both ways because Trump really wants THAAD deployment. but which is the missile defense system we're going to talk about. But Moon doesn't really want it. He's kind of delaying it. But of course, now there's this bigger threat, initiated by the ICBM launch. So it's a little unsure, like what's going to happen, whether or not that's going to be deployed. It's under environmental review now, which just means it's a delaying process. But I want to kind of highlight that because it's a very important part of the topic, that we have had a change in government in South Korea in terms of how the threat will be dealt with. Now, you can say, why is North Korea doing this? Well, first of all, they fear that that they're going to be blown up. All right. If you know anything about history, not too long ago, the U.S. made a deal with Libya where they agreed to give up their nuclear power and nuclear weapons production capacity in exchange for like economic aid and all these kind of things. And then a few years later, anybody know what the U.S. did to Libya? Yeah, we bombed them, we collapsed the government, okay? Iraq, we attacked Iraq. Did they have nuclear weapons? No. We thought they might have a couple, but they didn't, okay? And we attacked them. Have we attacked Iran? No. What does Iran have? Nuclear weapons, okay? There's also this country called the Ukraine, right? They used to be part of Russia. When they succeeded from Russia, they kept the nuclear weapons that were in their territory. They gave them up as part of a deal. What happened to the Ukraine? Yeah, they got attacked by the Russians, okay? So, it's not absurd for them to think that, like, they kind of need these weapons. It also strengthens the credibility of the regime internally. Like, this regime, the country doesn't have a lot going for it, right? Doesn't really have a lot of trade. A lot of people starve. They kind of, they torture people. They make them build things. They basically turn people into slaves. If your family commits a crime, they'll, if a family member commits a crime, they'll, imprison the whole family. When you approach, if you go on the tour and you approach, North Korea, you'll notice that a lot of the trees are all, burned down. The reason that is because they don't really have any fuel. So the people just burn down, the forests to, get fuel. Right? So this is, not, a happy place. So in order for the regime to sustain itself and justify itself, they have to be rah, we're taking on the United States, right? And they're limited, given how much they have. Their army has 1.6 million people in it, all right? For an impoverished country, that's the U.S., it depends on how you calculate it, but I think our end strength, our total troop level strength is around 500,000. Okay, Korea has about 600,000 troops. They have 1.6 million people that are kind of under arms, and they're developing all these weapons. So people say 25% of their budget goes to the military. That's a lot, so they have to justify themselves. They also want to bargain, and we can talk more about this later, but they basically want U.S. troops to withdraw from South Korea. That's another thing I probably should have mentioned earlier, but the U.S. has about 30,000 troops, mostly stationed between Seoul and that 38 parallel. There are a few in other parts, but most of our troops are there. So they want U.S. troops to leave. So their idea is, if we can get nuclear weapons and threaten the United States, then we can potentially, getting to the next part, they can bargain for troop withdrawal. Right? They'll say, look, U.S., if you don't take out your troops, we'll nuke Los Angeles. All right, and then once the U.S. says, okay, we'll leave, then it's easier for North Korea to invade South Korea, right? So they they want to make a deal to get us to leave. They want to undermine the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. You can already see that there's fighting, kind of a little bit of tension here now between you have the Moon government, which is more liberal, right? And you have Trump, which is posting missile defense. Now Trump's got a little bit of advantage because there was just big missile tests, but obviously, it's going to cause tension in the alliance, and they can make some money selling the weapons they develop. All right, but let's talk about kind of what just happened. So they launched what everyone agrees is an ICM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, which has, I think it's 4,000 kilometers or 3,400 miles. The distance it goes to be defined as an ICBM. This missile went 1.7 kilometers high and traveled 500 kilometers. But at a normal trajectory, right? That gives it the capacity to hit Alaska. They just didn't deliberately fly it that far. Instead of flying it like kind of more straight, it went up and like came right back down. Okay, it was their first ICBM launch. It did not have a nuclear warhead, and most people think that it'll take about 2 years for them to A, get a nuclear warhead that's small enough to fit on the top of a nuclear missile, and then B, successfully put those two together. But some people say, well, it could definitely be faster than that because no one was really expecting them to get an ICBM that fast. And then here's just like a little clearer kind of picture of like what it did, okay? And this is the missile. The Hwasong-14, it was a two-stage liquid-fueled international counter-ballistic missile. And it went up, and then it kind of had a reentry vehicle that goes down. And then this is kind of what they've released, some of what they've released, right? This is the picture of it taking off there on the left. This is some earlier photos that the U.S. had of like this missile on the truck, though they weren't sure if it was just for show or if it really worked. Now we know it works. And then there's like Kim, the supreme leader, okay, of North Korea, like celebrating the missile launch. And then those dudes there, they're probably really happy because if it didn't work, like who knows what would have happened to them. All right? The guy killed his own uncle. Okay. So, and then here's just like a little, these are kind of a little more detail. Could have put that a little earlier, but like these are kind of a little more detail about like some of the missiles they have and the tests that have occurred this year. Okay, so what could the U.S. do? All right, well, we could put sanctions on them, and we'll talk more about sanctions are economic penalties that like inhibit trade. We have a lot of sanctions on them now. They don't really work that well, and we'll talk more about why they don't later. We could be super nice. We tried that in the past. That didn't really work. We could engage them, just make like a small deal. That's kind of something that Moon is moving towards. Like, let's try to get some, families were separated during the war. Let's try to get some of the families to go back together. Maybe try some joint economic activity, small steps. But we tried that in the past, it didn't really work. We could try to get China to pressure them. That really hasn't worked. It may have worked a little bit, but it's kind of difficult, and we'll talk more about that. We could attack them. That would probably work, but a few million people at least would probably die, and that's a pretty significant downside. We'll talk more about why that'll happen. Or we could deploy missile defense. Which kind of brings us to the topic a little bit, but obviously none of these is a partial solution. How did the U.S. respond to this test? Well, immediately the U.S. and South Korea shot all these missiles, all right, into the East China Sea, kind of right to the east of South Korea. They got shot on the South Korea side. Obviously, we didn't want to shoot them up towards North Korea. They might have freaked out and started a war. So we kind of shot them over there. And we're just like, hey, we have these really cool missiles. And they're called Army Tactical Missile System and can be deployed rapidly and provide deep strike precision capabilities. North Korea was probably like, yeah, we know you can do that. Sure. And then on July 8th, we flew some B-2 bombers over like South Korea as a show of force. They also knew we have B-2 bombers, so that probably didn't really scare them too much. So there was a couple things we did. We also kind of had called like an emergency security council meeting of the United Nations on Wednesday. This is old. That's like July 5th. Secretary of State Tillerson's like, hey, you can't like, anyone who's supporting the economically needs to stop. Russia and China Russia and China's proposal is kind of this, like, okay, North Korea, you should stop testing nuclear weapons. And in exchange, the U.S. and South Korea should stop like their major military exercises. That's kind of their take. Trump's like, you've been behaving badly, as if North Korea is a child. And he's like, tells China, oh, something's got to be done about this. He's just kind of like, man, I have no idea what to do. So China, you got to do something. We'll talk about why it's kind of hard for China to do anything. Well, what does this mean? Well, there's a few things. The one is that there's arguably not like a huge increase of the threat. For a few reasons. Well, first of all, look, they don't have a warhead on the weapon. They're not just going to shoot a ballistic missile in the United States. It's going to like cause some property damage. Okay. Second of all, look, Seoul, Tokyo, all our allies in the region have been vulnerable. Like they could attack our allies in these major cities for years, right? With the smaller missiles that they have, and they didn't really do it. There's this thing called nuclear deterrence. The U.S. and Russia each used to have about 30,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other. We're all still sitting in this classroom. right? There may have been a little bit of luck involved in that. Obviously, weapons can be used, but it's probably not like a huge big deal that they can do this. They have approximately 15 nuclear weapons. Does anybody know approximately how many nuclear weapons the U.S. has that are active now?
1,000.
A couple thousand. Okay? So even if they managed to shoot all their nuclear weapons at the United States, and all their missiles worked, and all the nuclear weapons went to like where they were supposed to, I mean, that would definitely be a bad day in America, but it would be quite a worse day in North Korea. Right? Like, there would be nothing left of the entire country. All right? Very rapidly. So they kind of have a pretty big incentive, like, not to start a nuclear war with the United States. There was some article I read this morning. They interviewed somebody in Alaska when Mary can hit, and the guy's just like, I'm still worried mostly about losing my mules when they get out of the fence. He's like, I'm not really worried about North Korea like launching a nuclear weapon. But it does mean that North Korea is kind of moving faster than we thought. It's kind of unlikely, Trump keeps like threatening to strike North Korea. He's probably not really going to do that, okay? I've kind of seen different cards. I don't know exactly how many people live in Seoul, but the lower end estimate is like 10 million. I've seen estimates as high as 20 million. Probably just depends on like how you define the region. If you've ever been there, it's like a huge city. It's bigger than any city. Well, New York has like 18 million, so it's probably like as many people as live in New York approximately. They would also strike Tokyo, which is what, like 30 million people? Okay, so there'd be a lot of dead people pretty fast. There are also 30,000 U.S. troops, as I said, around Seoul in the demilitarized zone. And those troops are called a tripwire. Okay, if North Korea attacks South Korea, those troops are not there to live. All right, they're there to be killed. We know that almost every single one of them would die. Okay, why do we put them there? Because they're called a tripwire. They're a credible assurance to South Korea that if North Korea attacks, we will defend them. Right? If North Korea attacks South Korea and 30,000 U.S. troops died, there'd be a lot of support in America for a war on the Korean Peninsula. Okay? But most of those troops are not going to live. Even if you go to the DMZ, like, you pass under these, like, bridges. And what happens is we go up the road and you pass under the bridges, and in the event of a war, all these huge concrete barriers would drop down from the bridges. Okay? They're designed to slow the advance of the North Korean army. But they also mean that anyone above those bridges, good luck. Like, you can't get out, right? Until the North Koreans blow up those bridges. It's the only way you're getting out, right? At that point, you're kind of already dead, right? So that applies to anyone for whatever reason. If you're on the tour group, if you're in a soldier, like, you're doomed. There's also about, like, 300,000 Americans living in Seoul right now. So, probably at least half of them would die, too. So, if the Trump started a war, you'd be like, have 30,000 dead U.S. troops, probably at least 100,000 dead Americans, all right, plus everyone else. Plus, Seoul's kind of a major economic powerhouse. They produce a lot of stuff. I have an Apple, but, right, they're kind of known for the Samsung. They have a lot of economic activity. You have Tokyo, which would be attacked. That's another major economic power. So pretty much wrecked the global economy. Trump wouldn't really be able to say he created jobs anymore. And, we can't really, if Trump's like, yo, all you Americans, you better get out of Seoul. Like, what's North Korea going to do?
Right.
Yeah, they're going to strike. They'll be like, all right, the U.S. is about to strike us. They just told all the Americans to leave Seoul. And it's not like you can sneak 300,000 people out of Seoul. Right? That's a lot of people. Right? And we don't really even have enough, 30,000 troops is not a lot of troops. North Korea's got a 1.6 million man army. All right? And that doesn't even count, who they have reserves. There's, a couple million more. So if the U.S. were to, start a war in, North Korea, and the Korean Peninsula, we'd have to deploy more troops to the area. If you're old enough, during the Iraq War, when the U.S. initiated the Iraq War, it was obvious we were going to war. Move 100,000 soldiers over there. Okay, so you can't just move 100,000 soldiers without anybody noticing. Right, so if you kind of move over 100,000 soldiers and you start evacuating Seoul, North Korea is going to be like, hey, it's better to start this, right? And then we're going to have problems. So war is not a very good option. It does probably make it more likely that THAAD will get activated. There's going to be more pressure on South Korea to activate THAAD. There is probably a greater chance of an accidental war or a miscalculated war, and those are different. Accidents is like, oh, you have these soldiers out in the field and they're like, guns start going off, right? Or the bomb explodes or something launches. That's an accident, all right? Say those bombers are flying around and like a bomb falls out of them, lands on North Korea, right? That's an accidental war. A miscalculated war is just like you calculate wrong. You think it's better for you to like try it now or to try a different thing. Those war risks have probably increased. I actually read something that was kind of interesting. Like, okay, so who thinks a 10% chance of rain is a very high risk of rain? Right, not like a big deal, right? Who thinks like a 10% risk of nuclear war is like a high risk of nuclear war? Yeah, okay. I read an article and the author was like, it's like one of these Q&As and they're like, oh, well, how high of a risk do you think, what's the risk of a nuclear war on the Korean Peninsula? And this expert was like, oh, it's very small. It's only like 10%. 10% risk of nuclear war is not good. Okay. U.S.-South Korean relations are kind of strong now because of this test, but like I say, it's a little tricky because Moon's a liberal and Trump's not. I'll just say it that way. There is a sunshine policy that's the South Korea. This policy of kind of being more friendly towards the North is kind of called sunshine or like sunshine 2.0. There was a larger sunshine policy that was kind of more aggressive in terms of being nice to North Korea. And there was a lot of joint economic development. So this has kind of got called the sunshine policy. So we could attack them. I talked about that. There's problems with China. They don't really have a lot of influence. I'll talk about more of those arguments later. We could accept it. Most people say, if you read a lot of articles, most people are like, okay, yeah, they have nuclear weapons. There's nothing we can do about it. Just like when Russia got nuclear weapons, we didn't start a nuclear war. When China got nuclear weapons, we didn't start a nuclear war. North Korea got a nuclear weapon. Okay, and they could hit the United States. So people say kind of accept it and maybe deploy like some missile defense. And there's a little more of a debate about the latter. But there's really not... I haven't really read an article where someone's like, yeah, we should strike them. It's not really a good option. There is kind of this other interesting article I read about whether or not China helped them. They have missile advancements that are they're like, well, it happened faster than expected. They tested a new missile, not based one on Soviet designs, which they had before. The Hwasong rides on a Chinese vehicle. They look like variants, but that's just something to think of. We'll talk more about China and their role because that's pretty important. THAAD. So this is kind of how THAAD works. It's called Terminal High Altitude Aerial Defense. So there's a few key words. Terminal. Terminal means it intercepts missiles at the terminal stage, which means their final stage when they're on their way down. High altitude means it intercepts them pretty high in the air. Okay? So, look, area defense means it's a local. It's meant to intercept regional ballistic missiles. It's not meant to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles. And it's defensive. So, it's not designed to protect against intercontinental ballistic. It's not designed for boost phase missile intercept. There are other types of missile defenses that attempt to intercept at the boost phase. This is not designed to do that. It's generally designed to intercept short and intermediate range missiles. But what at the lower end of a short range missile is how far is that? Remember what I said? It's like 300 to 700 kilometers generally, okay? Is that a lot farther than the distance from North Korea to Seoul? Yes, okay, so it's not really meant to defend Seoul, right, where all the people live. I've seen public forum cases that are like, oh, North Korea's going to invade and they're going to kill everyone in Seoul, and they're like, missile defense. That. Okay. No, right? Don't connect with one another. That's not what it's for. All right, but I'll talk more about missile defense a little bit. So a few notes about missile defense. There is a big debate about THAAD, Terminal High Area Altitude Defense. The resolution does not specify this, right? It just says, is missile defense deployment in South Korea's best interest? A lot of people debate about that. It's something you can find cards on. There's arguments on both sides. They probably should have written the resolution to just say like South Korea should support the deployment of theater high area altitude defense, right? Because the other systems are not really controversial, right? Like there's not. We'll talk more about like some of the other missile defense systems, but like South Korea has some of their own missile defense systems, and people don't really say they shouldn't deploy them, right? That they should just allow themselves to die, right? There are some differences at that I'll talk about that make it a little more controversial. The resolution is also kind of strange because it doesn't identify which country's missile defense systems that you're supposed to debate about, okay? It doesn't even say, it just says like, deployment of missile defense systems in South Korea's best interest. Well, what about like Japan deploying missile defense systems? Like, does South Korea really want Japan to get attacked and have like their economy crash? Or does South Korea want Japan to get nervous so they're going to be attacked and develop nuclear weapons? Like, what do people in South Korea and China like think of Japan generally? Yeah, why not? Yeah, like imperialism world. They're not like, oh, Japan, just like get all the weapons you want. We're cool with it. When I was in South Korea, like I went to these different museums, and all the history museums are just about like how Japan invaded them and killed them all. And I was just kind of like, wow, you really should have something going for you other than how you've been destroyed by Japan, right? It would be kind of good to be like, hey, this is who we are. We're like proud of ourselves, but that's kind of a note. But it's very much in their like kind of culture, in their history, that they've just been kind of run over by the Japanese. If you go to Nanjing in China, you can go to the Nanjing Massacre Museum. Anybody know what that's about? Yeah, who committed the Nanjing Massacre? Japan. So it's just like, it's like going to a Holocaust museum. There's literally just pictures. You can spend hours walking through the museum of Chinese people being slaughtered by Japanese people. All right, and then at the end they have like a little binder of like supposedly every person who's been slaughtered like by their letter, and you can look through their initials. So, it's definitely not like Japanese friendly. I'm not really here to take a side on the debate, but my point is these countries. The reason after World War II, all right, after the U.S. beat Japan by dropping nuclear bombs on them, okay, they made an agreement with Japan of like, hey, we'll defend you, we'll protect you, but only if you don't develop nuclear weapons. Because they knew that would scare everyone in Asia, right? Because they're just like, look, Japan killed us when they didn't have nuclear weapons. We don't want them to have nuclear weapons. So if Japan gets nuclear weapons and develop arms, how are other countries in East Asia going to react, like China and South Korea? Yeah, there's going to be a huge arms race, right? So, all right, and then there's increased risk of conflict, increased risk of war, okay? But I'm just saying, look, even then the missile system like does not even like maybe U.S. missile defense. I heard somebody was writing a case that was like, oh, missile system, space missile defense is in South Korea's best interest because the U.S. is going to develop it and shoot down asteroids. And if an asteroid hit the Earth, everyone in South Korea would die. All right, that's kind of not really what was intended, but I'm just saying the topic is not. This topic's just like kind of please debate about this stuff we meant you to debate about, but it doesn't really say that. I think most of the debates will kind of end up being about it. But I'm just saying it doesn't really say that. There are also kind of, like I say, many different types of missile defense systems. There's naval protection systems, civil defense systems, regional and strategic. And then there's kind of a question of what it means to be in South Korea's best interest. Well, there's security. That's obvious. Like security against North Korea, security against other actors, maybe like China. But there's other interests. There are economic interests, right? One of the things we'll see is that China has retaliated because South Korea, under the previous president, really aggressively supported THAAD. China's retaliated economically by like reducing trade with South Korea. Well, that's hurt their economic interests, right? A country's interests aren't just military; they're also economic. Then there are political interests, like how are people in South Korea like treating the government, like as a result of their decision to employ missile defense. Then within that, there's different sectors of society, as like Casper had noted to me. Okay, you have the people. Right? And you have the government. Now, in a democracy, those interests tend to be more aligned, right? But if you think about the other resolution, is continued development of missile defense in North Korea's best interest. Well, you have the people and you have this totalitarian regime. Like maybe their interests don't collide. Then you have foreign relations, right? It's good for South Korea to have strong relations with the United States because that facilitates trade. It facilitates their own defense. Would it be good for South Korea if a nuclear missile from North Korea hit the United States? No, why not? What would happen? All right, yeah, okay. What would the U.S. do to North Korea? Right, we'd nuke them, okay? Where would all that radiation go? Yeah, what would happen to the global markets? Crash. Would there be a war in the Korean Peninsula? Yeah, would lots of South Koreans die? Yeah, so, okay. So I'm just saying what's kind of obviously like, maybe you say, well, it's in their best interest to be like secure, or like whatever. It's kind of a multifaceted thing, and it's something you got to think. A, it's something you got to think about when you're writing your speeches. But B, no matter what arguments you're making on both sides, I think you can always tie it back into the question of like best interest. Like it's not hard. As long as you get to like a war impact or like a political impact or an economic impact or security impact, you can always argue that like, you know, that's kind of is or is not in their best interest. I don't think the term is that like constraining like as it like kind of was meant to be. So generally, kind of what are benefits of missile defense? Well, it shoots down missiles. Okay. 2, it reassures our allies. So maybe they don't develop nuclear weapons, right? We don't want Japan to develop nuclear weapons. We don't want South Korea to develop nuclear weapons. That's why we defend these countries, right? Like in America now, you have this like, make America great again, right? Like, just worry about ourselves. Okay, well, the reason we worry about other people is because it's also like arguably in our self-interest. Right? If all these countries like don't feel secure and they develop their own weapon systems and they have wars, this is really going to screw us up. Right? It's going to screw up global trade like quite substantially. It's going to screw up the people who live in these countries. All right? There are like 1 million foreigners living in Shanghai. Not all Americans, but a lot of them are. Okay, so you know, depending on the president, it boosts relations between countries and it generally kind of supports technology development. Now, what are the problems with missile defense? So the biggest problem with missile defense is it destroys what's called mutually assured destruction. Also, you know, the acronym is MAD, which is kind of funny, right? Because it's madness, really, in a way, right? It's like we're going to survive because we all know we could obliterate the other side. But think about it. Say you're Russia, all right, and I'm America. And I have missile defense, and you don't. What can I do? Kill you and you can't retaliate. Right? The premise of nuclear deterrence, the basic core premise, is mutually assured destruction. Missile defense undermines mutually assured destruction. Right? It makes countries insecure. So it can make them more likely to preempt. So maybe they'd start a war before you get your missile defense deployed. What it always causes them to do is build more weapons. Right? Because the more weapons they have, there's only so many interceptors. We'll talk about those arguments. They can overwhelm it. But it's very, very, very important to understand this. This is really at the foundation of the negative arguments against missile defense. Like China does not support that, and we'll talk more about this, because it thinks it has capabilities against their missile system, vis-a-vis the United States. So they're afraid that the United States can nuke them, and they can't nuke the U.S. back. They think it'll undermine their deterrence. That's a core concept to understand. Because if you say, well, missile defense, why is that bad? We're defending against missiles. Well, the reason is because it undermines mutually assured destruction. It harms relations with other countries, right? Economic retaliation. It hurts South Korea's relations with China. And it causes political problems in South Korea, especially THAAD. Then you kind of have these issues of like, well, you have Russia, China, North Korea. Note the historical alliance. You have U.S., Japan, South Korea, all right, kind of Cold War. Anybody know what the Cold War is? What's Cold War? Yeah, it's like a period of hostilities between like the U.S. and Russia that basically divided the world, right, in the 60s, from the 50s, 60s, into the 70s, depending on where you define the end of it, right? There's a little détente, like during the 70s, right? It really kind of ended like in the 80s, the Cold War. Okay, but now you see things moving back towards the Cold War. Some people say U.S.-Russian tensions are higher now than they were during the Cold War. All right, but you can kind of see that like these things are developing. Now, what about nuclearization? All right, and proliferation and missile development. Why is it bad? Well, countries have an incentive to engage in preventative warfare. There's two types of kind of like attacks you might make. Preventative warfare is what the U.S. engaged in Iraq, or at least that was part of our rationale. We said, look, we want to attack Iraq before they really develop nuclear weapons or more if they have a couple. That prevents war. Preemptive war is when you attack because you think somebody else is going to attack you. You preempt that attack. Right? If there's a high risk of war on the Korean Peninsula right now, it's probably a preemptive war. Right? Where we're going to say preempt North Korea before they strike us. Or if North Korea is going to strike us, if we think North Korea is going to strike us, we're going to strike them. Right? You preempt them. There's a greater risk of accidents, which I talked about earlier, miscalculation, theft of weapons, and sales. And that's another huge problem with the Korean War. Right? There's all this nuclear material sitting around. All right? There's all this nuclear material sitting around. There's chemical and biological weapons sitting around. If North Korea was destroyed, who would have access to all those materials? Who knows? Maybe terrorists, right? You blow up the central control of those systems. What is it, a mad rush? Right? Is the U.S. going to go in there and take over irradiated North Korea? Who's going to want to take it over?
No one.
Well, I don't know about that. Terrorists? Who else? Russia, China. Does the U.S. want terrorists to take it over?
No.
Do we want Russia to take it over?
No.
We want China to take it over?
No.
So what happens to Korea after a war? Who knows? It's another reason we can't really fight the war, right? Because then we're going to be fighting Russia and China for control over North Korea. Or somebody's going to have to securitize it so weapons don't get stolen by terrorists, right? So it's not like if you just blow the thing up. We see what happens when you blow up Iraq. What happened? Did they just be like, oh, people are like, oh, cool, we're going to go vote now. We're going to go buy some voting machines, rig them up, we'll have an election, whoever wins, we'll be cool with that. Is that what happened?
Power vacuum.
Yeah, there's like power vacuum. You have, historical conflicts between the Sunnis and the Shiites. Now they're all like killing each other because they're mad. All right, past you see the same thing happen in Syria. Libya's not stable. Look, Afghanistan's been a mess for however many decades. All right, people aren't just going to be like, this is cool. We're all friends now. Thanks to the U.S. for blowing us apart. So it's going to be a huge mess, right? Like there's no answers to that either. And I don't mean like answers in a debate, but I'm just saying there's no answer to this question of like what happens post-war. Look, it's right on the China's border. That's why I included a map that had China, right? China does not even like U.S. missile defense, THAAD, in South Korea. They're not particularly happy that we have 30,000 troops there. What would they think of the U.S. having 100,000 troops on the Korean Peninsula right on their border? Yeah, they're not going to go for that. It'd be like if China took over Canada and deployed 100,000 troops. And we're like, that's cool, right? Like, it's just not really going to happen, right? So there's all these kind of problems. And then what's the U.S. going to do? Like, occupy it forever? Even if we get it, what are we going to do with it? I mean, Trump be like, well, we'll steal their oil. But, I mean, come on. This is like not, right? This is like not practical, all right? So I'll go take over this radiated Earth. I'm just saying there's huge disincentives to a war, right? Why is it obviously good? Well, countries can defend themselves against the U.S. I already talked about that. There's mutual deterrence. There's technology development, national pride. They could kind of use an ICBM to break the alliance. I talked about those arguments before, all right? But you can, on either topic, maybe make arguments as to why nuclearization and missile development are good. There's a few things to note, just kind of like when you're reading the literature. DPRK, Democratic Republic of North Korea. Pyongyang is the capital. Kim Jong is the supreme leader. All right, and this is a dynasty. So his grandfather started it. All right, then he's kind of like the third leader. This guy's pretty ruthless. His uncle tried to build ties with China, economic ties. We're not really sure exactly what happened to his uncle, but one of two things happened to his uncle. He was either fed to starving dogs, or he was lined up and blown apart by an artillery fire. And I don't mean like executed with a gun. I mean they took like rockets and shot him at him and blew him into pieces. That's probably a better way to go than the dog, right? There's South Korea, ROK, Seoul, Moon. The one thing is sometimes they'll just refer to the country by its capital. So that's just something when you're reading. THAAD is Terminal High Area Altitude Defense. PAC-3 is South Korean missile defense systems. There's also a PAC-2. since I won't do that other lecture, I'll just tell you PAC-2 is a Patriot 2 missiles that the U.S. originally had and had in Germany. And South Korea has bought a lot of those missiles, anti-missile systems from them. Those intercept missiles, but not missiles with chemical and biological. They have no capability against missiles, all right, that have weapons of mass destruction on them. But PAC-3s do. So sometimes it's called NMD, National Missile Defense. WMD refers to weapons of mass destruction. Those are chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. MAD, we already talked about. NBC refers to nuclear, biological, chemical. CBW, chemical and biological weapons. CW, chemical weapons. ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile. SLBM, submarine launch ballistic missile. MLRB, medium range ballistic missile. All right, just a couple more things to know. There's Abe Shinzo, who's the Prime Minister of Japan. They'll talk a lot about Japan literature, so you should know that. Z, they usually just call him that. He's the President of China. Tillerson is U.S. Secretary of State. Mattis is U.S. Secretary of Defense. I think we know what all these other words mean. Just a few things we didn't really talk about. Let's see. The constructive engagement is kind of similar to the sunshine policy, where you're trying to make kind of positive outreach to kind of engage them and kind of move things along. Then there's containment. Containment is when you're just like, all right, we're going to kind of build an alliance and stop you from going along. Carrot refers to nice things you do. A stick is a hardline measure. So some of the articles will talk about carrots and sticks. You have first strikes, which is just striking them first rather than waiting for them to strike you. Security dilemma is something you'll read a lot about in literature. They'll use this term. Security dilemma just refers to the idea that when you try to secure yourself, that scares other people, right? Why? Well, it undermines MAD, right? Mutually assured destruction. And sometimes these systems can have offensive components. Like, for example, one of the things you have to build with a missile defense is a radar system, right? And a surveillance system, because otherwise, how are you going to know, okay, if another country launches their missiles? Well, when you build that radar system and that surveillance system, that also enables you to more effectively target the other country with offensive weapons, right? So even defensive measures, both directly and indirectly, can create a security dilemma, right? But it's kind of a dilemma because obviously, right, if you do securitize yourself, that causes insecurity on the part of the other actor. But if you don't securitize yourself at all, then you're going to be insecure, right? So it's like a dilemma, right? Either way, you're both secure and unsecure. So, but there's a lot of literature that just kind of refers to that, especially the literature that's kind of more like anti-militarization. Those types of things. So are there any questions on this part of the lecture or comments? And then next thing I'll talk more about that.